Good evening, everyone. Tonight we will be telling the full story of the first Dark Souls game. Please feel free to leave a comment with what game you'd like to see us cover in the future. Drop a like if you enjoy these, and subscribe if you want to be here for future stories. It helps more than you might think. Now get comfortable, and let us begin. Dark Souls is a game about cycles. It's a game about fire and darkness, about gods who feared what they could not control, and about what happens to a world when the people holding it together finally let go. Its story is not told to you directly. Its lore lives in item descriptions, in the architecture of ruined cities, in the brief and often cryptic words of characters who have been waiting in the dark for a very long time. What follows is that story told plainly and in full, from the moment the world came into being to the moment the player character stands at the edge of the first flame and decides what comes next. In the beginning, the world of Dark Souls was gray. Not dark, not light. Gray. Unformed. Shrouded in fog, covered in enormous stone formations called gray crags, and in vast ancient trees called arch trees that grew across a landscape without seasons, without weather, without the passage of time in any meaningful sense. The dominant form of life in this world was the everlasting dragons, stone-scaled beings of immense age and power who endured across an existence that had no real beginning and no real end. Their scales were the source of their immortality, an innate property of their bodies rather than something acquired or earned, and those scales made them invulnerable to any conventional harm. They could not be killed. They could not be injured in any lasting way. They simply were permanent fixtures of a permanent world. This period is called the Age of Ancients, and what defines it most clearly is the absence of disparity. There was no heat because there was no cold to give heat meaning. There was no life in the sense we understand it because there was no death to give life its shape. There was no light because there was no darkness against which light could be seen. The everlasting dragons existed in a state of absolute equilibrium, a world where nothing fundamentally changed and nothing fundamentally needed to. It was not an unhappy world. It was not a happy world either. It was simply a world that had not yet become anything in particular. What ended it was fire. The first flame appeared without explanation, deep somewhere in the earth, spontaneous and unprecedented. It was not lit by anyone. It was not created through any act of will or intention. It simply ignited, and its arrival introduced into the world everything that had not been there before. Heat and cold existed now, because fire creates warmth and the absence of fire creates cold. Life and death existed now, because things that burn eventually burn out, and the awareness of ending gave meaning to the fact of existing. Light and dark existed now, because a flame illuminates its surroundings and creates shadow beyond its reach. The first flame did not simply add something to the world. It created the conditions by which the world could become different things at different times, and in doing so it made history possible. Before the flame, nothing changed. After it, nothing could stay the same forever. Near the flame, in the light and warmth it produced, there were souls. Not the ordinary souls that the game's systems deal in as currency, though those are related, but something more fundamental. Concentrations of the flame's energy given form, vast and powerful beyond anything the creatures of the gray world had encountered. The game calls these the Lord Souls, and there were 4 of them, and they were found by 4 very different beings who emerged from the darkness that the flame had created. The first was Nito, who took the soul of death and became Gravelord Nito, the first of the dead. With the power of his Lord's soul, Nito gained dominion over death itself. He could administer the ending of living things, spread disease and decay across distances that no ordinary creature could hope to affect, and govern the process by which life concluded. He was, from the moment of his ascension, something that held itself apart from the world it attended. Death is not a participant in life. It is what life approaches. The second was the Witch of Izalith, who took the soul of life and became one of the most powerful flame sorcerers in the history of the world. She was not alone. She had daughters, a number of them, who accompanied her and shared in her power to varying degrees. These daughters would come to be known as the Daughters of Chaos, though that name belongs to a later and darker period of their story. At the moment of the witch's ascension, they were simply her children and her companions, practitioners of fire magic under the guidance of the most powerful flame sorceress who had ever lived. The witch and her daughters established themselves in an underground city called Izalith, and from there they pursued their understanding of fire with the kind of scholarly passion that, in other circumstances, might have led only to discovery. In these circumstances, it led to catastrophe. The third was Gwyn, who took the soul of light and became Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight. He was the most consequential of the four lords by a significant distance. His lord's soul gave him power over lightning, the most dramatic and visible expression of light as a physical force, and he used that power with an ambition and a directness that set him apart from the other lords immediately. Nito was defined by his function. The witch was defined by her curiosity. Gwyn was defined by his will to shape the world around him according to his vision of what it should be. He had loyal knights, the Silver Knights, who followed him with a devotion that outlasted the age they lived in. He had the capacity and the desire to build, and he had a fear, deep and persistent and ultimately defining, of what the dark produced, of what humans were, of what the age that would eventually follow his own represented. The fourth lord's soul was different from the other three in nature and in consequence. It was the dark soul, and it was found by a being the game calls the furtive pygmy. The dark soul did not consolidate power the way the others did. It was a soul that resisted concentration, that wanted to be divided rather than held, and the furtive pygmy honored this nature by splintering it across an enormous number of smaller fragments. From those fragments, humanity was born. Every human being in the world of dark souls carries within them a tiny piece of the original dark soul, a fragment of that power that manifests as what the game calls humanity. This is not simply a game mechanic. It is the core of what humans are in this mythology, and it is the reason Gwyn feared them. The dark soul was the counterbalance to the flame, the dark that the light created, and every human being carried that darkness inside them as a fundamental property of their existence. The furtive pygmy disappeared from the historical record almost immediately after their ascension. The other lords chose not to record what they knew of the pygmy, and the game's evidence strongly suggests this was deliberate. What the pygmy had done, what the dark soul represented, was something Gwyn preferred not to acknowledge. Armed with their lords' souls, the new gods looked at the world around them and found it occupied. The everlasting dragons were still there, still dominant, still eternal. And now there were beings in the world with power sufficient to challenge them, and the desire to do so. The war that followed was won because of two key advantages. The first was Seath. Seath the Scaleless was a dragon, but he had been born wrong by the standards of his kind. He was an albino, blind, with tentacles in place of proper legs, and no stone scales anywhere on his body. He had been born mortal in a species defined by its immortality, an outsider among a people for whom belonging meant sharing in a property he would never have. His resentment of the other dragons was old and deep and complete. When Gwyn came to fight the dragons, Seath offered him the knowledge that made winning possible. The stone scales that made the dragons immortal were vulnerable to lightning. Gwyn's Lord Soul had given him precisely that power, and Seath's betrayal gave him the specific intelligence needed to use it effectively. What Seath received in exchange was the possibility, at least, of the immortality he had always been denied. He chose his side correctly. He was the first traitor in the history of the world, and he was rewarded for it. With Seath's intelligence in hand, Gwyn led the assault on the dragons. His lightning cracked apart their stone scales and left them vulnerable for the first time. Nito followed with his dominion over death and disease, the full capacity of his lord's soul unleashed against creatures who were finally capable of dying. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters wove enormous firestorms across the arch trees and the territories the dragons had occupied for as long as the world had existed. What had been the permanent landscape of the Age of Ancients burned, and what replaced it would be claimed by those who held the Lord's souls. The war was not brief, and it was not without cost, but it ended in the victory of the new gods. The everlasting dragons were destroyed, most of them, leaving only lesser descendants. The drakes and wyverns that appear throughout the game are echoes of the true dragon line, creatures who inherited some portion of that ancient heritage without the immortality that defined it. One true dragon survived the war intact, and that was Seath himself, whose betrayal had purchased his survival, and whose survival would eventually lead him deeper into obsession and madness than anyone around him anticipated. The Age of Ancients ended. The gray crags and the arch trees and the eternal sameness of the old world gave way to the Age of Fire, the Age of the Gods, the age in which the world finally had a history. What the gods built in the centuries following the Dragon War was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of any world. Gwyn established Londo, his capital city, built on a mountain so that it could be closer to the sun he loved. It was a city of extraordinary scale, its architecture reflecting the power and ambition of its creator, lit by golden light and populated by gods and their knights and the creatures that served them. Londo was not simply a city. It was a statement about who owned the world and how that ownership was meant to be understood. Gwyn had a family. His firstborn son was a god of war who had inherited his father's connection to sunlight, a warrior of genuine distinction who commanded the respect of Londo. He tamed a storm drake, a descendant of the old dragon line, and through that act formed an alliance with the dragon descendants that Gwyn found unacceptable. The son was stripped of his deific status, his name removed from every official record, expunged from the history that Londo maintained about itself. He became the nameless king, carrying nothing of his former life except his power and his absence from the world's memory. The covenant called the Warriors of Sunlight, present throughout the game, bears the imagery of this forgotten son. The fact that a being powerful enough to warrant erasure rather than mere punishment was part of Gwyn's own family tells you something significant about the anxiety running beneath the surface of the Age of Fire's prosperity. Gwyn's daughter Guinevere was the princess of sunlight, a goddess of warmth and fertility who was genuinely beloved in Londo. She eventually married a being called the flame god Flan and departed with him, leaving the city behind. Her departure would matter more later than it did at the time, because what remained in Londo after she left was not Guinevere herself, but an illusion of her, maintained by her younger sibling, to give the impression that she had never gone. That younger sibling was Gwyndolin, Gwyn's last child and the only god who stayed in Londo through everything that followed. Gwyndolin was born with an affinity for the moon and for the dark arts of illusion and manipulation, powers that did not align with the sunlight imagery that defined Gwyn's household. Gwyn, disturbed by this, raised Gwyndolin as a daughter despite Gwyndolin's nature, hiding what the child was from the court of Londo. Gwyndolin's devotion to Gwyn persisted despite this, perhaps because devotion to a parent who has shaped your life entirely, even in painful ways, is difficult to separate from the self that parent helped create. Gwyndolin would spend the rest of the age managing the illusions that kept Londo functioning as a center of divine authority, long after the reality underneath those illusions had collapsed. Seath was given his reward. Gwyn bestowed upon him the title of Duke, gave him a fragment of his own Lord's soul, and provided him with the Duke's archives, a vast complex of towers and libraries where Seath could pursue his research without interruption. The fragment of Gwyn's Lord's soul was not enough to grant Seath the immortality he had always wanted, not by itself, but it was a significant elevation. Seath retreated into his archives and began the work that would consume him completely. His research focused on immortality, on the primordial crystal he had located, and on the process of soul and life and what sustained them. His experiments required subjects, and the subjects he chose were not always willing. Creatures were brought to his facilities against their will. People were taken and subjected to processes designed to illuminate the mechanisms of existence. He became brilliant and monstrous in equal measure, and neither quality tempered the other in any way. Nito withdrew to the Tomb of Giants, the vast underground complex where he made his domain. His role in the ongoing Age of Fire was the administration of death, and he performed that role from a distance. He established the Gravlord's servants, a covenant devoted to spreading death in his name, and he largely ceased to participate in the surface world. The Lord of Death did not need to be where life was happening. His function was to attend its ending. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters worked in Izalith and pushed the boundaries of flame sorcery further than they had gone before. The city of Izalith was significant, one of the major centers of power during the Age, and what happened there would eventually be one of the worst disasters of the era. But during the height of the Age of Fire, Izalith thrived. Gwyn also gave fragments of his lord's soul to 4 human rulers, the leaders of a city called New Londo, in recognition of their wisdom and what he described as their foresight. This elevation of humans to a position of elevated power was unusual. Gwyn's relationship to humanity was complicated by his fear of the dark soul they carried, and choosing to share power with humans at all, even exceptional ones, reflected the particular regard he had for these 4 rulers. New Londo became one of the important cities of the Age, and its four kings became something between human and god, elevated by the fragment of Lord's soul they shared. What happened to them later was one of the most complete collapses in the history of Lordran. Human civilization grew during the Age of Fire. Cities and kingdoms were established, and humans lived in a world structured around the power of the gods and the warmth of the first flame. The great knight Artorius patrolled the forests near Ulasil. The giant archer Hawkeye Goff took a position of honor in Gwyn's service. The executioner Smoke served Anor Londo despite being denied the knighthood he wanted, his methods deemed too brutal even by the standards of a world at war. The Lord's Blade Kieran served as an assassin for Gwyn's interests. Dragonslayer Ornstein commanded the Silver Knights who protected Anor Londo. These figures, their loyalties and their losses, are some of the most emotionally resonant pieces of the game's background. The world was not paradise. No world is. But there was structure and meaning and the flame burning at the center of it all, and for a time that was enough. The first flame was finite. This is the unavoidable fact at the heart of Dark Souls, the thing that every god and every human in the game is responding to in one way or another. Fire burns. It consumes what sustains it. And eventually, no matter how large it was at the beginning, it diminishes. When the flame began to fade, the response from the gods was not coordinated or strategic. It was individual and desperate, each of the great powers of the age moving toward their own solution without the others being able to stop them or help them. The Witch of Izalith was first to act, and her action was the most catastrophic in its immediate effects. She decided to create a new first flame. This was the logic of a scientist and a powerful sorcerer confronting a problem within her domain. The flame is fading, she controls fire, therefore she should be able to produce a new flame to replace it. The ambition was extraordinary. The execution was successful and disastrous simultaneously. What the witch produced was not the first flame. What she produced was the Chaos Flame, a fire of tremendous power that was fundamentally different in nature from what she had intended. Where the first flame burned cleanly and sustained, the Chaos Flame consumed and mutated and spread without discipline. It did not offer warmth, it offered chaos. The flame of chaos turned on Izalith immediately. It consumed the witch herself, pulling her soul and the souls of two of her daughters into a new and terrible configuration, fusing them together into a being called the Bed of Chaos. The Bed of Chaos was not a creature in any ordinary sense. It was a vast, corrupted entity, a Lord's soul twisted by a failed magical experiment into something that pulsed with chaotic destructive energy and sat at the center of what had been a thriving underground civilization. It could not be reasoned with. It could not be negotiated with. It simply was, and what it generated was destruction. The daughters who had not been incorporated into the Bed of Chaos suffered their own transformation. The Chaos Flame spread through Izalith and altered everything it touched. The daughters of the witch, beings who had been powerful and intelligent flame sorcerers, were converted into the spider-bodied chaos demons that populate the demon ruins below Blighttown. They kept some of their intelligence, fragments of who they had been, but their physical forms were irrevocably changed. Most of them remained in the ruins of Izalith, unable or unwilling to leave the place that had been their home and was now a monument to their mother's failure. One daughter escaped. Quelana was the only daughter of Izalith to flee before the Chaos Flame reached her. She found her way to Blighttown, the vast and toxic slum built over the drainage system below Firelink Shrine, and she concealed herself there among the disease and squalor, hiding beneath a false appearance that the Chaos Flame's corruption had given her body. She felt tremendous guilt about her survival. She had survived because she ran, and running had saved her while her mother and sisters were consumed. She knew that staying would not have helped them. She knew this with the clarity that people often have about difficult truths they cannot quite accept. She sat in Blighttown for the remainder of the age, and eventually did the only thing she could think of to honor what had been lost. She developed pyromancy. Pyromancy was a system of fire magic accessible to ordinary humans, built from what Quelana understood about flame sorcery, but simplified and reworked, so that it did not require the Lord's soul power that had destroyed her family. She took a single student, a man named Salaman from the Great Swamp, and she taught him everything she had developed. Through Salaman, pyromancy spread to the human communities of Lordran and became one of the major magical traditions of the world. Quelana gave something real and lasting to the world, from her grief. which is its own kind of grace. The demons that the chaos flame produced were another consequence of Izalith's fall. They spread out from the ruins and posed a significant threat to the surrounding regions. Gwyn sent his knights to fight them, a campaign that lasted for some time and produced casualties among figures who would otherwise have occupied different places in the game's story. His great knight Artorias was one of the most prominent figures in this campaign, and his story is one of the most affecting in all of Dark Souls, but it belongs to a slightly later period and will be addressed in full. The Chaos Witch Quelug, one of the daughters transformed by the Chaos Flame, made her home at the base of Blighttown above the passage to the demon ruins. Her body was spider-like below the waist, fully transformed by the chaos, but her upper half retained her original appearance and some of her intelligence. She was territorial and violent, attacking anyone who approached, though her motivations were more complex than simple aggression. Her sister, known only as the Fair Lady or Quelan, had sealed herself deeper in the ruins, her body slowly filling with the toxic eggs produced by the Chaos Flame. The Fair Lady had gathered the Chaos Servant Covenant around her, drawing the sick and the suffering to her presence and absorbing their toxins into herself in an attempt to relieve their suffering at the cost of her own. She was slowly dying of this generosity, and she stayed. Quelug knew this. She stood at the gate not simply as a guardian of the ruins, but as something closer to a warden, keeping the world out of a space that held her dying sister. When the player kills her in the game, her soul goes to the Fair Lady who feels it pass. The Fair Lady does not know why she feels suddenly weaker, only that something is gone. She asks if her sister is well. It is one of the quietest and most painful moments in the game. The corruption of New Londo happened through a different kind of failure. A figure called Darkstalker Katha, one of two ancient serpents who move through the history of Dark Souls as manipulators of events, found the four kings and offered them access to a power called the Dark Arts, a system of magic that worked directly with the abyss, the fundamental darkness that was the deep counterpart to the flame. The four kings accepted this knowledge. They began practicing the dark arts and establishing a group of warriors called the Dark Wraiths to wield this power. The Dark Wraith's primary function was to invade the worlds of other humans and steal their humanity, the fragments of the Dark Soul that each person carried, collecting it in service of the abyss. When the scale of what the four kings had done became apparent to the other gods, three figures in Anor Londo made a decision that was brutal and necessary and possibly wrong all at the same time. They flooded New Londo. The city sat on a cliff above a vast underground lake, and there were floodgates that could be opened. Three individuals, whose identities the game does not state but whose actions are recorded in the items found in the flooded ruins, opened those gates and drowned the city. Everyone in New Londo, the four kings, the Dark Wraiths, and the ordinary population of the city, who had nothing to do with any of it, was sealed beneath the water to stop the spread of the abyss. The gates were then sealed from the inside by a character the player encounters in the game, a man who chose to stay and guard the seals rather than escape, who has been standing in the flooded dark ever since. New Londo sits below the surface of the world in Dark Souls, accessible through the Valley of the Drakes, its buildings still standing beneath the water, its undead inhabitants still wandering. The Dark Wraiths and the four kings are still there, hollowed and lost, still possessing the darkness that led to the city's destruction. Gwyn watched all of this happen. He watched Izalith fall to the Chaos Flame. He watched New Londo drown. He watched Seath descend deeper into madness in his archives, his experiments becoming less comprehensible and more monstrous with each passing year. The gods were leaving Anor Londo. Guinevere had already gone. The Witch of Izalith was gone in a different and more terrible sense. The Furtive Pygmy was a name that no longer existed in any official record. The great civilization of the Age of Fire was not falling apart so much as burning down slowly from multiple points simultaneously. The first flame kept fading. There came a moment when Gwyn understood that no other solution was coming. The Witch of Izalith had tried to create a new flame and produced a catastrophe. No one else had found a better answer. The flame was going out, and when it went out, the Age of Dark would begin. And what the Age of Dark meant was the ascendancy of humanity, the unchecked expression of the Dark Soul, and the end of the age that Gwyn had built and ruled and organized his entire existence around. Gwyn was afraid of the dark in a way that was not simply personal. It was theological. It was existential. His entire civilization had been built on the premise that the flame was worth sustaining, that the age it had made possible was worth preserving at any cost. He had spent his entire existence in opposition to the dark, had built Anor Londo on a mountain to be closer to sunlight, had given fragments of his own Lord's soul to others to bind them into the structure of the Age of Fire, had fathered children and built alliances and organized the political reality of Lordran around the maintenance of what the flame represented. The thought of it ending was not something he could accommodate. So he made the choice that defined everything that follows in Dark Souls. Gwyn took his remaining loyal Silver Knights and traveled to the kiln of the First Flame, the deep place where the First Flame burned. He walked into it. His Lord's soul, the most powerful single force in the Age of Fire, was offered as fuel. The flame consumed him. It burned brighter for a time, extended, pushed back. The Age of Dark was delayed. The cost was complete and absolute. The act of linking the First Flame, of sacrificing a Lord's soul to rekindle it, did not preserve the person who performed it. Gwyn survived the process in a physical sense, his body continuing to exist and even to function, but everything that had made him who he was burned away in the flame. His consciousness, his personality, his fear and his ambition and his love for the sunlight and his complicated relationships with his children, all of it was gone. What remained was a hollow, a mindless shell animated by ancient instinct, still present at the flame, still defending it against anyone who approached, but no longer Gwyn in any meaningful sense. His Silver Knights tried to follow him into the flame. They did not have enough power to survive even the diminished way he had. They burned. Their charred remains, armor and weapons half fused to the stone, are still scattered throughout the kiln when the player arrives there at the end of the game. The sacrifice of Gwyn also created the Dark Sign. This is where the lore becomes genuinely complex, and where Gwyn's act of preservation becomes an act of harm. The Dark Sign is a brand that began appearing on humans throughout Lordran after Gwyn linked the flame, marking them as undead. Those marked with the Dark Sign could not die permanently. When killed, they revived, their bodies reconstituting through the power of the Dark Soul fragment each human carried. The Dark Sign was Gwyn's attempt to use the connection between humanity and the Dark Soul to fuel the flame, to keep it burning by tying human existence to it in a way that produced an endless cycle of sacrifice. The problem was hollowing. Each time an undead died and revived, they came back slightly diminished. Memory grew hazier. Identity became harder to hold on to. The internal coherence that made a person rather than simply a body still moving eroded with each death until there was nothing left. This final state, the hollow, was not death. It was worse than death. It was the continuation of existence after everything that made existence worth having had been lost. The response in Lordran was to build the Undead Asylum, a vast prison in the far north. Undead from across the land were collected and sent there, sealed in cells where they could sit and slowly hollow without causing problems in the cities and kingdoms where the living were trying to continue. The asylum was a solution to a social problem. It did not treat the undead curse. It contained the people afflicted by it, stored them in the dark until they were no longer recognizable as people. A prophecy existed alongside the curse, and it is important to understand who was spreading it and why. Frampt, one of the two primordial serpents and the one who served Gwyn's memory and the continuation of the Age of Fire, had been telling the humans and undead of Lordran that a chosen undead would one day arise. This chosen undead would escape the asylum, travel through Lordran, ring the bells of awakening, gather the Lord's souls, and travel to the kiln of the First Flame to link it as Gwyn had done. The prophecy was intended to produce exactly that outcome. Frampt needed someone to continue the cycle. Calling them chosen was a way of making the role sound like destiny rather than manipulation. Darkstalker Cathay had a different message for any undead willing to listen. Cathay served not the flame but the dark, not the continuation of Gwyn's age but its ending and replacement with an age of dark in which humanity, and the dark soul they collectively carried, would finally come into its own. Cathay's version of the prophecy led to the same journey through Lordran and the same accumulation of Lord's souls, but ended not at the flame but at the throne of the Dark Lord, the human who chose to let the fire die and become sovereign of the age that followed. This is the world into which the player character wakes at the beginning of Dark Souls. They are in a cell in the Undead Asylum. They are marked with the Dark Sign. They do not know who they are or how long they have been there. What they know is that they are still there, still aware, not yet fully hollow. And then a corpse falls through the ceiling of their cell, and attached to that corpse is a key. The undead asylum sits at the far northern edge of Lordran, a fortress of stone built into a cliff face above a world that has largely forgotten it exists. It was built to hold people who could not die, which meant it did not need to be comfortable or humane. It needed to be secure. The cells were small and the corridors were dark, and the hollowed undead who had lost themselves over years of imprisonment wandered the halls in the mindless way of things that have nothing left to want. The asylum was not a place of cruelty exactly. It was a place of indifference, which in some ways is worse. The people inside it had been deemed inconvenient by a world that did not know what else to do with them, and so they had been stored here to wait. The player character wakes in one of these cells. The game provides no explanation of who they are or how they came to be here. They are undead, marked with the dark sign, and they have been here long enough that they were apparently settled in for the long decline into hollowing. Then a corpse falls through the ceiling of their cell. The body lands on the floor in front of them, and tucked into its clothing is a key that opens their cell door. The corpse belonged to Oscar, Knight of Astora, who is still barely alive when the player finds him after escaping their cell. Oscar tells the player what little he knows. He had a mission, given to him by a now dead bishop of his order, to find and free an undead in the asylum, who might be the chosen undead of prophecy. He does not know if the player is truly the chosen undead. He is too close to death to know much of anything. He gives the player the Estus flask, the fire-based restorative that will sustain them throughout the game, and he passes on the mission. Escape the asylum, head to Lordran, ring the bells of awakening. He dies shortly afterward. When the player returns to the asylum later in the game, they find Oscar again, but Oscar has hollowed, turned violent, and has to be dealt with accordingly. His arc, compressed into 2 brief encounters, is a quiet illustration of everything the undead curse means in practice. The asylum has a demon, an enormous creature called the Asylum Demon, that the player encounters early and must eventually defeat to escape. The fight is a practical introduction to what Dark Souls demands from its players, but in lore terms the Asylum Demon is simply one of the demon creatures produced by the Chaos Flame of Izalith, far from its origin point, serving no particular purpose except to occupy the space it has been placed in. The demon's soul has the same quality as every other soul in the game. It can be spent as currency. It can be consumed for its power. The great and the terrible are made equal in the economy of souls. When the player defeats the Asylum Demon and escapes through the outer gate, a large bird appears. This is Kingseeker Framp's arrangement. The giant crow had apparently been waiting, or at least had the habit of attending the asylum's exit on the chance that someone worth collecting might emerge. It carries the player south to Firelink Shrine. Firelink Shrine is the hub of Dark Souls, the place where the player returns between journeys, where bonfires are linked and levels are gained, and the various characters who have found their way to this neutral ground make their homes. It sits at a crossroads, physically and narratively. It is the point from which every direction the game offers is accessible, and it is the place where the player first begins to understand the scale of what they are being asked to do. The shrine itself is a roofless stone structure built around an extinguished fire, a bonfire that once drew on the power of a firekeeper to sustain itself. The firekeeper associated with Firelink Shrine is a woman named Anastasia of Astora, sealed in a cage below the main bonfire, her tongue cut out, her soul bound to the bonfire's maintenance. She cannot speak. She can only gesture and tend the flame. The fire she tends gives the player a place to rest and a means of leveling up, the central mechanical function of bonfires in the game. Her inability to speak, her imprisonment in service, is another expression of the way the game's world treats those it considers functional rather than important. The characters who have gathered at Firelink are a varied group, and their stories unfold across the length of the game. Petrus of Thorolund is there early, a cleric from a northern religious order who claims to be waiting for companions on pilgrimage. He is lying. His companions arrive eventually, including a blind woman named Rhea of Thorolund who has come to Lordran seeking the rite of kindling, a ritual of fire, and 2 knight escorts. The escorts hollow in the Tomb of Giants. Petrus knows this and does not tell Rhea. Later in the game, if the player is not careful, Petrus kills Rhea himself, presumably to prevent her return from embarrassing him. The game never announces any of this. You have to piece it together from item descriptions and timing and the location where Rhea's body can be found. Solaire of Estora is perhaps the most beloved character in Dark Souls, a sunlight warrior who has come to Lordran to find his own sun, a personal and slightly unhinged expression of devotion to the concept of sunlight and its connection to the gods. He is cheerful and warm in a world that offers very little of either, and he invites the player to join the warriors of Sunlight Covenant and fight alongside him as a phantom. His questline ends, for most players, in tragedy. Deep in the lost Izalith, there is a sunlight maggot, a parasite that drives its host to a kind of localized madness, and Solaire finds it and puts it on and goes hollow. If the player does not know how to prevent this, Solaire becomes an enemy in the final approach to Gwyn. If the player does know how to prevent it, Solaire survives to appear as a phantom summon for the final boss fight, and his presence there, his particular kind of joyful determination brought to the most difficult moment of the game, is one of the most emotionally satisfying things the game can produce. Siegmeyer of Katarina is an enormous man in onion-shaped armor who has come to Lordran for adventure and found himself stuck at obstacle after obstacle, waiting cheerfully for a solution to present itself. He is kind and well-meaning and not particularly competent, and his story is one of the game's most human. His daughter Sieglinde is looking for him, worried. Their reunion, if the player facilitates it, is good. What can happen to Siegmeyer in Lost Izalith, where he throws himself into a pit of chaos eaters to give the player a chance and sometimes does not survive it, or survives it but has hollowed from the exertion, is not good. The game does not make Siegmeyer's fate easy to prevent. It makes it easy to miss entirely, and then asks you to process it after the fact. Frampt is at Firelink Shrine, sleeping in a hole below the main structure. When the player has rung both bells of awakening, he wakes. He is an enormous serpent, ancient and fawning, with a manner that oscillates between genuine reverence and obvious manipulation. He tells the player that they are the chosen undead, that the ringing of the bells has confirmed the prophecy, and that their destiny is to gather the Lord's souls, fill the Lord vessel, and link the first flame. He presents this as honor and purpose and destiny. He does not present it as a choice, because he does not want the player to think of it as one. The bells that the player must ring to wake Frampt and proceed with the prophecy are located at two distant points in Lordran. The first is above Undead Parish, at the top of a tower that requires fighting through the burrow of Undead Burg and the Undead Parish itself. The second is deep below, accessed through Blighttown and the poisonous swamps at the base of the world. Undead Burg is a ruined human settlement, the kind of place that was probably unremarkable during the Age of Fire. A residential and commercial district that has been deteriorating since the gods left and the undead curse spread. The undead soldiers who wander its streets are not monsters in any original sense. They are people who were here when things were still functioning, who have been in decline long enough that they no longer remember what they were waiting for. The Capra demon that guards a critical passage in the Burg is another creature of the Chaos Flame, displaced from Izalith and now occupying whatever space it has found. The gargoyles that guard the first bell tower atop Undead Parish are Gwyn's constructs, placed there intentionally, guardians of an access point that was once important enough to warrant protection. The descent to the second bell requires passing through the depths, the sewer network beneath Undead Burg, where a creature called the Gaping Dragon presides over a community of thieves who have been living in the dark. Below that is Blighttown, one of the most disliked areas in the game among players, a vast shantytown built on wooden platforms over the drainage outlet at the base of Lordran, toxic and dark and difficult to navigate. Blighttown was home to the outcasts and the powerless of the Age of Fire, the people who ended up at the bottom of the world's social structure and built what they could from what was available at the bottom. The people there are now undead, hollow or nearly so, and the swamp at the base of it all leads to the ruins of Izalith and to Quelana and to the second bell. The second bell is guarded by Quelaag, the Chaos Witch-daughter of the Witch of Izalith. She is a significant boss, a powerful creature whose spider body makes her fast and whose chaos fire is dangerous. Killing her gives access to the passage to the demon ruins where her dying sister waits. After the player rings the second bell, the game opens further, and the path toward Anor Londo and everything it contains becomes available. Between Firelink Shrine and Anor Londo stands Sen's Fortress, a trap-filled structure of enormous size that was apparently designed as a final test for those seeking to enter the City of the Gods. Its walls are covered in swinging blades and rolling boulders, and the snake men called serpent soldiers who operate its mechanisms. It is not subtle. It is a gauntlet, a challenge that exists to ensure only the sufficiently capable reach what lies beyond. At the top of Sen's fortress is an iron golem, a massive Gwyn-constructed war machine that guards the final gate. Its soul, like every other soul in the game, is a usable resource. What is more interesting than the iron golem itself is the figure sitting in a cage suspended from the fortress walls, a man named Crestfallen Merchant, who has been trapped there after running afoul of the fortress's traps, calling out to anyone passing below. He has food and water somehow, and has been surviving indefinitely in his cage, which is its own kind of undead persistence. Londo, when the player finally arrives, is astonishing. The city is beautiful in a way that the rest of Lordran is not, golden light falling across enormous stone architecture, scale and grandeur in every direction. It is the aesthetic of divine power given physical form, the city that Gwyn built to reflect his sense of what a god's domain should look like. It is also, by the time the player arrives, almost entirely empty. The gods left Londo when the flame began to fade in earnest. They went somewhere else, or simply ceased to be present, and the city they left behind is maintained by an illusion and patrolled by the few remaining loyal knights who stayed. The illusion is Gwyndolin's work. Gwendolyn, the last child of Gwyn, who stayed in Londo while everyone else departed, has spent the interim maintaining the appearance of divine habitation through magic. The most important element of this illusion is Gwynevere herself. Gwynevere left Londo when the flame faded. She married flame god Flan and departed with him. She is not there. What sits on the throne in the great hall of Londo, enormous and warm and apparently benevolent, is an illusion of her, sustained by Gwyndolin's magic, designed to give the impression that the Princess of Sunlight still blesses the city and that the gods are still present and powerful and interested in the affairs of the world below them. The illusion Gwynevere gives the player the Lord Vessel and directs them to fill it with Lord Souls. If the player attacks the illusion Gwynevere, it dispels, and Gwendolyn becomes hostile and can be fought as a boss. The real Gwendolyn is beneath Londo, in a tomb complex deep in the city, surrounded by illusions of hallways that stretch infinitely in each direction. Fighting Gwendolyn means walking through these false corridors toward a figure who attacks from a distance with dark moon sorcery and retreats constantly, a boss who fights like someone who has spent their entire life avoiding direct confrontation. The other major guardians of Londo are Ornstein and Smach. Dragonslayer Ornstein was one of Gwyn's 4 greatest knights, the commander of the Silver Knights who protected Londo. Executioner Smach was the last of Londo's cathedral guardians, denied the knighthood he wanted because of his cannibalistic tendencies, but still occupying his position as protector of the cathedral. They fight together as a duo in one of the game's most famous and most difficult encounters. What is left unsaid about this fight, and what the lore reveals in pieces, is that the Ornstein who fights alongside Smach may not be the real Ornstein. The real Ornstein, some evidence suggests, left Londo to search for the nameless king, the forgotten firstborn of Gwyn. The warrior in the arena may be a spiritual remnant, an echo, serving the same protective function through loyalty outlasting consciousness. The game does not confirm this. It simply provides enough evidence for the question to feel important. What the Lord Vessel represents is both practical and mythological. It is a bowl-like artifact designed by Gwyn to contain Lord Souls, the great concentrated expressions of power that each of the age's major figures holds. Filling it requires taking those souls by force, which means confronting and defeating Nito, the Witch of Izalith's remnant in the Bed of Chaos, Saith the Scaleless, and the 4 kings of New Londo. Each of these confrontations is a journey to a different corner of Lordran and a different chapter in the history of the Age of Fire's collapse. The primordial serpent Frampt will transport the player who places the Lord Vessel on Firelink Shrine's altar directly toward the endgame, toward Gwyn, and the linking of the flame. The primordial serpent Kathe is available to players who have explored far enough to find him, deep below New Londo in the abyss itself. Kathe makes a different offer. He tells the player the truth about the cycle, that linking the flame is not salvation but repetition, that the true path for an undead bearing the dark soul is to let the flame die and become the dark lord of the age that follows. He will also transport the player if they choose to place the Lord Vessel with him instead, and the endgame plays out the same either way. Only the final choice at the kiln differs. Nito lives at the bottom of the world. Below the catacombs, which are accessible from Firelink's shrine through a passage that descends steadily into the dark, lies the Tomb of Giants, and at the deepest point of the Tomb of Giants is where Nito has made his domain. He did not build the tomb. The tomb is ancient, predating the current form of Lordran, a vast system of burial chambers and catacombs that exist because death has always needed somewhere to put what it produces. Nito took ownership of it after the Age of Fire began and made it the center of his administration of death for the whole of the world. The descent through the catacombs is a journey through the work of a necromancer named Pinwheel, who has somehow stolen the rite of kindling from Nito and retreated to a chamber at the end of the catacombs to study it. Pinwheel is a strange figure, appearing as a creature with 3 faces and 6 arms, apparently composed of multiple bodies fused or stacked together. The game never fully explains what Pinwheel was or how he became what he is, only that he took something from Nito and that Nito presumably was not pleased. Pinwheel himself is not a particularly powerful boss, one of the easier encounters in the game, and his presence in the narrative is more curious than threatening. Beyond Pinwheel is the Tomb of Giants itself, a place of absolute darkness that requires a light source to navigate at all, and where enormous skeletal giants patrol corridors that drop away into further darkness on both sides. The giants are remnants of something ancient, creatures that existed before the current age in some form, and their presence in Nito's tomb gives the place a quality of accumulated endings, everything that has died over the history of the world gathered and preserved in this cold place below everything else. Nito himself, when the player reaches him, is an enormous figure wrapped in a burial shroud, his form a mass of skeletal remains fused together around the Lord's soul at his center. He is the first of the dead, and he looks exactly like what that title implies. He wields a great sword and can call on a miasma of death and disease that afflicts anyone in his presence, and the skeletal giant remains that fill his chamber will rise to assist him if they are not dealt with. He is not a figure who chooses violence. He is a figure who has been where he is, doing what he does for so long that the distinction between choice and function has become meaningless. The player must take his Lord's soul. Nito does not offer it willingly. What is most affecting about Nito is not his power but his context. He is the only one of the 4 lords who has not made any terrible mistake during the Age of Fire. He did not try to create a new flame and produce a catastrophe. He did not descend into mad experimentation. He did not accept power from a corrupting source. He simply administered death, as he was made to do, from the bottom of the world, and waited. He will wait as long as there is something to wait for, and when that ends he will administer that ending too. The Duke's archives sit above the shore of a vast underground lake at the northern edge of Lordran, a complex of towers and libraries and holding facilities that Seath has occupied since Gwyn gave them to him after the Dragon War. Getting there requires crossing a forest called Darkroot Garden, navigating a crystal cave, and dealing with the various creatures that Seath's long years of research have produced as side effects of his work. The moonlight butterfly, encountered in Darkroot Garden, is one of Seth's experiments, a creature of luminous crystal that has long since escaped whatever containment it was kept in and made its home in the forest. The crystal golems that appear in Darkroot Basin and elsewhere are Seth's constructs, magical automata made of crystallized soul energy. The women trapped in crystal in the Duke's archives and the crystal cave are Seth's most distressing experiments. Humans who have been partially crystallized and left in a suspended state that is not death but is not recognizable as life either. Seath himself is encountered twice. The first meeting is scripted. The player enters a room at the end of the archives and finds Seath already present, enormous and pale and tentacled, and he kills them immediately. Not as a boss fight, as a cutscene. He simply kills the player character, and they wake in a prison cell inside the archives, captured rather than defeated in any meaningful sense. Escaping the prison and making the way back through the archives to fight Seath properly is the next task. The scripted death is unusual for Dark Souls and serves a specific purpose. It demonstrates that Seath is not a creature who observes the rules of the game's combat. He acts when he acts, and the player's presence is irrelevant to his timing. The second encounter is the proper boss fight, in Seath's crystal cave, where he has retreated to the location of the primordial crystal that grants his immortality. He is genuinely immortal as long as the crystal is present, and the player must destroy it before they can harm him. This is the revelation that Saith's immortality is contingent, that the thing he has spent his existence pursuing was always dependent on an object he could lose. He is brilliant, and he is monstrous, and he is the oldest and most persistent resentment in the history of the world, a being who betrayed his own kind for what he wanted and got it and lost himself completely in the having of it. Saith is the father of sorcery. The Vinheim Dragon School, the primary institution that teaches sorcery in Lordran, is built on the research Saith developed in the Duke's archives. Big Hat Logan, the great human sorcerer whom the player may encounter multiple times in the game, comes to Lordran specifically to study at the archives, driven by the same intellectual hunger that drove Saith himself. Logan eventually gets access to Saith's research and goes mad attempting to recreate it. The parallel is deliberate. The game is drawing a direct line between Saith's fate and Logan's, suggesting that the pursuit of Saith's knowledge carries with it the same capacity for self-destruction that claimed its original architect. Lost Izalith is the most difficult area in Dark Souls to navigate, not because of its enemies, which are numerous but manageable, but because of its geography. The floor of Lost Izalith is largely absent. Large sections of what were presumably intact floors in the city of Izalith have collapsed into the chaos beneath, leaving a landscape of narrow ledges and invisible drops over a roiling expanse of chaotic fire. The game has never been subtle about the fact that Lost Izalith was developed under time pressure and is less polished than the rest of its environments. The lore reason for this is that the Chaos Flame consumed everything, left nothing whole, and what remains is the ruins of a city that was destroyed from within. The Chaos Witch Quelaag, if she has been defeated in Blighttown, is not the only daughter the player encounters. The fair lady, Quellian, is present in the Chaos Servant Covenant chamber partway through the area. She is sick, her body infested with the toxic eggs of the Chaos Flame, slowly dying from the accumulated suffering she has absorbed from those who sought her out. She is gentle and confused, her senses diminished by her condition, and she speaks to the player with a warmth that the environment around her makes feel almost unbearable. The bed of chaos itself is at the deepest point of Lost Izalith, and it is one of the game's most emotionally strange boss encounters. It is not, strictly speaking, a fight in the conventional sense. The bed of chaos is an enormous root structure, animated by the corrupted remains of the Witch of Izalith and two of her daughters, a mass of chaotic organic material pulsing around a central flame. To defeat it, the player must destroy two orbs on either side of the creature and then reach the flame at its center and extinguish it, all while the floor collapses beneath them and the roots actively try to knock them into the void. The encounter has frustrated many players because it relies more on platforming and positioning than on the combat mechanics the game has spent 30 hours building. But in lore terms, that mismatch is appropriate. The bed of chaos is not an enemy that fights you on your terms. It is a disaster. You do not fight a disaster. You survive it and dismantle it and deal with the grief of what it represents after the fact. When the bed of chaos is destroyed, what ends is the source of all demonic life in Lordran. Every demon in the game, every chaos creature had the bed of chaos at the root of its existence. The player does not feel this as a triumph in any traditional sense. The Witch of Izalith made a terrible mistake and was consumed by it, and her daughters were consumed alongside her, and what the player is doing is ending something that should never have existed in the form it took. There is no victory here. There is only a conclusion. New Londo ruins are reached through the Valley of the Drakes, a passage beneath Firelink Shrine. The ruins are flooded, their streets and buildings still standing beneath dark water, lit by a faint luminescence that makes everything look more beautiful and more wrong than it would in total darkness. The undead citizens of New Londo wander these flooded corridors alongside the Dark Wraiths, the warriors who serve the Four Kings in their corruption. Getting through New Londo requires draining the water by opening a valve in the ruins themselves, a mechanism built specifically for the purpose of exposing the lower levels where the Four Kings wait. The Four Kings do not require a fog gate approach or a dramatic entrance in the conventional sense. The passage to them leads through a dark doorway and drops the player into the abyss, a place of absolute darkness without floor or ceiling or walls, only empty black in every direction, with a dim illumination immediately around the player character. The Four Kings emerge from this darkness one at a time, humanoid figures of vast size made of something that looks like fading light, wearing the remnants of the royal trappings of New Londo, but degraded almost beyond recognition. They were given a fragment of Gwyn's own Lord's soul, these four rulers. They were elevated beyond humanity. They were trusted, and they were approached by Katha and shown the dark arts, and they chose to use that power in ways that cost their city everything. Fighting the four kings in the abyss is fighting in the dark against enemies that kill quickly, and the urgency of the encounter reinforces the desperation of the situation. The four kings have been in the abyss since New Londo was flooded, preserved by the fragment of Lord's soul they share but diminished by the darkness and the time and the isolation. What attacks the player is what remains of four human beings who were given extraordinary power and made a catastrophic choice with it, who have been in the dark ever since, who have forgotten what they were and remember only the hunger. The man who sealed the gates to New Londo from the inside is still present when the player arrives. He is called Ingward, a survivor of the flooding who chose to stay and guard the seals that kept the dark wraiths contained. He has the seal key and will give it to the player who proves themselves, and he has been in the flooded ruins for an indeterminate amount of time, alone, keeping his post in the dark. He is not hollow. He is one of the more human presences in a game full of things that used to be human, and his continued coherence after so much time spent in isolation in a flooded city of the dead is its own kind of statement about what loyalty to a purpose can do for a person. This section of the story is not part of the base game. It exists in the DLC content called Artorias of the Abyss, but it is presented as backstory to events that the base game references throughout, and it is essential to a complete understanding of what happened to the world before the player arrived in it. Artorias was one of Gwyn's four greatest knights, perhaps the most famous of them, known as the Abyss Walker. He had made a covenant with the Grey Wolf Sif and with the Abyss creatures of Ulasil, finding a way to walk in the abyss without being consumed by it, a feat no other human had managed. He was loyal and powerful and, in the mythology of Dark Souls, something approaching genuinely heroic in the old sense, a champion who was capable and good and whose story ends in complete tragedy. Ulasil was a human civilization built near what is now the Darkroot Garden, practitioners of a kind of ancient illumination magic that predated the sorcery that Seath later systematized. The town was prosperous, and the magic it practiced was its own kind of art. Beneath Ulasil, something was buried. Specifically, someone was buried. The grave of Manius, a being the game describes as the primeval human, the father of the abyss, lay beneath the ground of Ulasil, sealed and forgotten. Katha found it. Katha, the dark serpent who preaches the end of the age of fire and the ascendancy of humanity, went to the people of Ulasil and persuaded them to disturb the grave of Manus. He told them it was an ancient human, which was true. He did not tell them what disturbing that grave would do. The people of Ulasil dug up the body of Manus, and the abyss erupted from beneath their city and began consuming everything. Manus is one of the most important and most ambiguous figures in Dark Souls. The game describes him as a primeval human, which appears to mean a human from a time before the current age, one of the beings who existed during or just after the furtive pygmy divided the Dark Soul into fragments. His Dark Soul fragment was either larger or more pure than those of ordinary humans, giving him power that exceeded what the current age's humans possessed. Being dead and buried for an unknown length of time had not diminished this power. Being dug up and disturbed by a town of people who did not understand what they were doing had catastrophic consequences. Manus woke, and the abyss spread from him in every direction. Artorias came to Ulasil when the abyss began consuming it. He came to fight the darkness and save what could be saved, and the story of what happened there is one of the most affecting sequences of events in the game's lore. He found Sif, his companion wolf, and used his own Abyss Walker's power to create a protective barrier around Sif, shielding the wolf from the abyss at the cost of exposing himself to it without the protection of the covenant that normally let him walk in darkness safely. Artorias was consumed by the abyss, not killed, consumed. His body kept functioning, animated by the darkness that had overwhelmed him, his arm broken in the process of whatever happened in the moments before the abyss took him fully. He became a creature of the abyss wearing the armor and form of Artorias, with no remaining connection to the person he had been. The player character, sent back in time by Manus to the period of Ulasil's destruction, finds Artorias in this state. They are forced to fight him, and the fight is the game at its most mechanically and emotionally demanding. Artorias moves like someone who has been completely broken and reformed around the breaking, his attacks wild and powerful, and shot through with a kind of desperate energy that the intact champions of the game do not have. He is not performing heroism, he is lost in it. Killing him is not a defeat of an enemy. It is an act of mercy, and it is also the only choice available, and the game knows this and makes it feel like both things simultaneously. After dealing with Artorias, the player confronts Manus himself, the father of the Abyss, the primeval human whose resurrection caused all of this. Manus fights with the Abyss directly, his attacks extensions of the darkness around him, his power immense and not entirely explicable within the game's normal framework. He has also, somehow, reached forward through time and stolen something, fragments of a pendant whose significance the game hints at but never fully explains, a connection to the chosen undead or to someone who once wore the pendant that gives him a personal investment in the events of the main game timeline. He is defeated. The Abyss in Ulasil does not immediately dissipate, but Manus's active influence over it is ended. What remains of Ulasil, after the Abyss and Manus and the events of the DLC, is the Darkroot Garden, the Darkroot Basin, and the forest that surrounds them in the main game. What remains of Artorias is his grave, his armor and weapons available to the player as equipment, and the legend of the Abysswalker that various characters in the main game reference as a story of heroism, without knowing its full outcome. The fight with Sif is the emotional climax of the Artorias story, and it happens in the main game rather than in the DLC. Sif guards the grave of Artorias in Darkroot Garden, and the player must fight her to retrieve the Covenant of Artorias, a ring that allows travel in the Abyss, necessary to reach the Four Kings. Sif is a great grey wolf, enormous and loyal, and she fights to defend her master's resting place with a ferocity that makes the encounter genuinely difficult. When she is reduced to low health, she begins to limp. Her movement changes. She slows. She keeps fighting, because she will fight until she cannot, but the visual of a wounded wolf still trying to protect the grave of a long-dead companion is among the most affecting images in Dark Souls. Players who have completed the DLC and understand Artorias' full story, and who know that Sif was protected by Artorias at the cost of his own corruption, feel this fight differently than those who encounter it without that context. Both versions of the experience are valid. Only one of them is complete. With the 4 Lord Souls collected and the Lord Vessel filled, the path to the kiln of the first flame opens. It requires one more passage, through a gauntlet called the Kiln Approach, guarded by the Black Knights, the remnants of Gwyn's elite soldiers who followed him toward the flame and were incinerated by it. What remains of the Black Knights are not hollow in the conventional sense. They are something between ash and purpose, still carrying their weapons, still patrolling the routes they once walked in life, still hostile to anyone who approaches the place they were destroyed protecting. They are among the most dangerous ordinary enemies in the game, their patterns deliberate and their damage extreme, and the approach to the kiln through their patrols is the game's final test before the end. The kiln of the first flame is a place of deep heat and dimming light. It is not an ornate or impressive location. There are no grand halls or soaring architecture here. The kiln is what it is, a place of burning, stripped of everything that is not essential to that function. The charred remains of Gwyn's Silver Knights, the ones who tried to follow him and were consumed, are still scattered across its floors, weapons and fragments of armor fused to the stone where they fell. The flame itself is visible at the far end, smaller than it once was, burning lower, producing less light and less heat than it did when Gwyn first sacrificed himself to it. The Age of Fire is genuinely ending. What the player is walking toward is the final decision about what happens when it does. Gwyn is waiting at the flame. Not the Gwyn who built Anor Londo and led the war against the dragons and made the terrible choice to feed himself to the flame to buy more time. That person is gone, burned away by the very act of sacrifice that preserved the flame. What waits at the end of Dark Souls is Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, a hollow, a shell, a body still animated by an ancient instinct that has outlasted every other aspect of the person it once housed. He looks like Gwyn. He moves like Gwyn. His crown is still on his head, and his armor is still his armor, and he fights with the lightning that was always his signature, the power his Lord Soul of Light produced and that he turned against the dragons and used to build his age. But there is nothing behind it. No strategy, no fear, no calculation. He attacks relentlessly and endlessly. The Way of Fire defends itself, not because it has decided to defend itself, but because consuming whatever approaches it is simply what it does. This is what Gwyn became when he linked the flame. This is what linking the flame costs. The fight with Gwyn is the emotional destination of Dark Souls, and it is worth sitting with what the game has built toward this moment. You have traveled through a world that is falling apart at every seam, through cities built by gods who have abandoned them, and corridors that used to be meaningful and are now just obstacles, through the stories of people who came to Lordran for various reasons and found various kinds of ruin. You have taken the Lord's souls from the beings who possessed them, each one a figure whose story ended badly in its own particular way. You have understood by now what the cycle means. Someone links the flame burns for a time, the flame fades. Someone is called to link it again. The undead curse is the mechanism that produces the someone. The prophecy of the chosen undead is the story told to make that mechanism feel like destiny rather than necessity. And now you are here, at the end of it, looking at what used to be the most powerful being in the world, and what you do next is a choice that the game actually gives you. Many players report that fighting Gwyn feels different from fighting other bosses in Dark Souls. The difference is partly mechanical. Gwyn is highly susceptible to parrying, the counterattack mechanic that requires timing a defensive move precisely to the moment an attack lands, which staggers the attacker and opens them to a critical hit. Gwyn can be parried repeatedly, his offense shut down again and again by a skilled player, and the experience of parrying the final boss of a game built around the threat of death is intensely satisfying on a gameplay level. But the difference is also emotional. Every other boss in the game is threatening in ways designed to inspire fear and caution. Gwyn is threatening in ways that inspire something closer to sadness. He is not a villain. He is not an obstacle in any traditional narrative sense. He is a tragedy, a person who loved something so much that he destroyed himself to preserve it and is now reduced to mindlessly defending the embers of what he gave himself for, with no awareness of what he is or what he lost. There is a character who can be summoned as a phantom for the Gwyn fight if certain conditions have been met. Solaire of Astora, the Sunlight Warrior met early in the game, can appear beside the player as a golden phantom and fight alongside them against Gwyn. Solaire's presence here, if the player has done what was necessary to prevent his hollowing and lost Izalith, is one of the most purely joyful things the game can produce. It does not change the melancholy of the fight. It does not alter the reality of what Gwyn has become. But it means the player does not face the ending alone, and that matters in a game that has spent its entire length making the player feel the weight of isolation. When Gwyn is defeated, the player stands before the first flame. Two choices are possible, and the game represents them simply. Interact with the flame and link it, sacrificing yourself to rekindle it as Gwyn did. Or walk away, let the flame die, and allow the Age of Dark to begin. Linking the first flame is the ending that Frampt has been guiding the player toward since Firelink's Shrine. The player character approaches the flame and is consumed by it, burning away as Gwyn burned away, becoming the new Lord of Cinder. The flame burns brighter for a time. The Age of Fire is extended. The undead curse continues. The cycle begins again, and somewhere in Lordran, an undead is already marked with the dark sign, already in a cell somewhere, waiting for a corpse to fall through the ceiling with a key attached to it. The game frames this as the Firekeeper ending, and it is what Frampt has always wanted. It is also, the game strongly implies, not actually a resolution. The flame will fade again. The cycle will produce another chosen undead. The cost of keeping the Age of Fire going is the ongoing suffering of every undead in the world, every person marked with the dark sign who will endure death after death until they hollow or until they make it to the kiln. The victory of linking the flame is also the perpetuation of everything that produced the need for it. The Dark Lord ending is what Katha has been pointing toward. The player turns away from the flame and lets it die. The light goes out. The Age of Dark begins. In this ending, the world does not end. It changes. Humanity and the dark soul it carries finally come into their own, in an age no longer organized around the maintenance of a dying fire. Katha and his serpents surround the new Dark Lord with what reads as genuine reverence, not the fawning manipulation of Frampt, but something that feels more like recognition. You have done what the Dark has been waiting for an entire age to see done. You are what the furtive pygmies set in motion when they divided the dark soul into 1,000 pieces and gave each human a fragment of what was always meant to be theirs. What the Age of Dark actually means for the people who would live in it, the game does not show. The ending cuts to black before any consequences can be observed. This is the essential ambiguity of Dark Souls, the thing that neither ending resolves and that the game intends should remain unresolved. Both choices have logic and cost. Linking the flame keeps the world recognizable at the price of the person who links it and the perpetuation of the undead curse. Letting the flame die ends the cycle at the price of uncertainty about what replaces it. Frampt, if the player has spoken to him throughout the game, will leave Firelink Shrine and presumably cease his work if the player chooses the Dark Lord ending. Kathe, if the player has met him, will similarly disappear after the events at the kiln. Neither serpent is present to see what follows the ending they spent the age maneuvering toward. Whatever comes next is not their story to tell. The lore of Dark Souls is, at its deepest level, a meditation on cycles and the cost of maintaining them past the point where they serve their original purpose. The Age of Fire was real and valuable. The civilization that the first flame made possible was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of any world. The gods who built it were not simply villains or manipulators. Gwyn loved the sunlight and feared the dark and made decisions that were, in his terms, reasonable responses to that fear. The Witch of Izalith tried to solve an impossible problem with the best tools available to her and failed catastrophically. Nito simply did his function. Seth was motivated by a resentment so old and deep it had become architectural. The foundation on which everything else he was had been built. None of them were simply wrong. All of them were caught in something larger than their individual choices, a set of circumstances that the first flame created and that every decision they made responded to without being able to control. The Age of Dark was always coming. The question was never whether it would arrive, but what the world would do when it did, and the answer the Age of Fire gave was to keep trying to stop it at every cost, including the cost of the people who suffered through the undead curse while the flame was artificially maintained. The player character is the inheritor of all of this. They are one of the humans who carry a fragment of the Dark Soul, one of the countless undead produced by Gwyn's desperate last measure, one of the many who were sent to the asylum and forgotten. What makes them the chosen undead is not fate or divine selection. It is the fact that they are still there, still coherent, still moving forward while everything around them collapses. The game does not tell you that you are special. It tells you that you kept going when others did not, and that this is sufficient. The choice at the end of the game is the game's central question asked plainly. You can sustain what exists, knowing its costs and its limitations. Or you can let it end and face what comes after with the understanding that what comes after might be better and might be worse, and that the uncertainty is the price of actually moving forward rather than cycling endlessly in place. Dark Souls does not tell you which choice is correct. It gives you both, and it trusts you to sit with the weight of them. The world of Dark Souls is a world in which everything that could go wrong has gone wrong, and in which the people and gods who caused the going wrong were doing so out of love or fear or loyalty, or the kind of ambition that is difficult to separate from a genuine desire to create something worth having. It is a tragedy in the oldest sense, not a story about evil people doing evil things, but a story about the gap between what people intend and what results from their intentions, played out at mythological scale. The undead curse, the fading flame, the hollows wandering the corridors of ruined cities, the abandoned thrones of gods who believed they were doing right by their people even as they sentenced those people to an endless cycle of loss and revival. All of it follows from a single moment in which the first flame appeared in a gray world and introduced the concept of change. Everything that followed was change, and change could not be stopped once it had started, and the cost of trying to stop it was paid by everyone who came after the moment it began. Dark Souls ends where it begins. A fire, a choice, a world waiting to see what comes next, and somewhere in the dark, something stirs. That is the story of Dark Souls, a world built around a dying fire, and the question of what we owe to the things we have built when they can no longer sustain themselves. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, a like and a subscribe go a long way. Sleep well, and we will see you next time.